So welcome everyone to the Trade Policy Research Forum. We're here for our monthly webinar, December, starring Isabela Manelici, who's going to be speaking on responsible sourcing, theory and evidence from Costa Rica, with comments by Sara Schoenfeld, who's the founder of the Trade Impact Foundation. So just bear with us for a couple of minutes as people come into the room, and then we'll make a start fairly promptly. Hannah, do you want to say a word or two about the forum before we get started?
Yeah, why not? That would be great. Thank you, Ben. So everybody's super welcome today. I see some friends here that I really know. Hildegun is here, and Gregory and Artie. And please, why don't you jump on in the chat box and just let us know where you're from, because that's always so much fun to see. Sylvia's here too, and Ivan, good to see you all. So yes, my name is Hannah Norberg, and I am the co-founder of the TPR Forum together with Ben Shepherd here. And as you may know, we run a monthly webinar, and our aim is to do exactly like the logo depicted on the logo, which is to build a bridge between policymakers and researchers, but also between researchers within different, what is that word? There's a word for that. Disciplines is the word. Yes. Thank you, Ben. And also all across the world and across generations. And so our idea here is to really deep dive into the goings on in research, and then make that applicable to policy to bridge that gap. So, and we've been running for over 2 years. And everything that we have done so far, no FOMO, everything is up on the website, the tprforum.org website. That's where we put all the recordings of previous webinars. And so that we will do for here today too. A couple of housekeeping rules. Having a great day with words today. So everything here is recorded, and the presentations will be up on the website. So you can just relax and focus on understanding, and you can catch up with all that later. We would really like this to be a conversation. So please use the Q&A box or the chat box, and put your questions and comments there as we go, so that we can have a conversation. And if you haven't already connected to us on LinkedIn or on Twitter, please do. And I've also made sure with Isabela and Sara that it's all right to connect with them, so that you can follow up with any questions that you might have. And so I think that's pretty much it. Ben, is it?
Yeah, that sounds good to me. Let me then introduce our speakers. We have a tradition of doing very rapid introductions at TPR Forum so that we get straight into the paper. But we're really lucky to have a great combination of speakers today. We've got Isabela Manelici, who's an assistant professor of economics at LSE, and she's going to be talking to us about her paper, Responsible Sourcing, Theory and Evidence from Costa Rica. Now, when I introduced that, I've got to say that I made a mistake when I marketed the webinar, because I used a colon and not a question mark after responsible sourcing. And I'm hoping that one thing we can talk about, because every word of this paper is very carefully written, so the question mark is there for a reason. And I'm hoping that we can talk about what exactly it's doing there, and what we can learn about the nature and impact of responsible sourcing from the way that it's set up in the paper. So really looking forward to Isabela's presentation. Then we have discussant comments from Sara Schoenfeld, who is the founder of the Trade Impact Foundation. And as Hannah said, something that we try to do here is build bridges between different parts of the trade policy community. So we have Isabela, who's an academic economist, and we have Sara, who is a lawyer and involved in corporate social responsibility work. And what we're hoping is that we can have a dialogue between economic research on the one side and law and practice on the other side. So I'm looking forward to a really lively Q&A session. As Hannah said, please feel free to put questions in either chat or the Q&A box. And with that, I'll hand it over to Isabela to tell us more about her paper.
Thank you so much. Let me just first, share the slides. A second. First have to make them. Okay, let me share. Can everyone see my slides?
Yep.
Wonderful. So first and foremost, thank you so much for the invitation, Hannah and Ben, and thank you for everyone who's dedicating an hour of their time to this presentation. I know everyone's time is very valuable. So without further ado, today we will talk about responsible sourcing, both from a theory and an empirical evidence perspective in the setting of Costa Rica. So what is responsible sourcing? Why should we care? There's an increasingly widespread adoption by superstar firms, typically foreign multinationals, of policies over the practices in their supply chain. And the emphasis that we will have in this paper is on the working condition practices. So how workers in those supply chain connected firms in a sourcing economy are treated. So what kind of requirements are multinationals introducing that need to be met by their suppliers? Requirements on wages to be paid to their workers, benefits, maximum hours that those workers can work, safety standards, the right to unionize. The way that these policies are typically introduced is through through a supplier code of conduct that the multinational puts forward. And what typically happens is that such supplier codes of conduct become legally binding for the suppliers of these firms. So in order to do business with these multinationals, the suppliers must comply with these new supplier codes of conduct. So what are the stated objectives from the perspective of the multinational? The way they set it up is that they want to homogenize conditions, working conditions, in their supply chain across countries where they operate and source from. And most notably, they want to benefit those workers whose livelihoods are most precarious, which typically tend to be low-wage workers in developing countries. So with this background in mind, the question that we're asking is, what is the impact of responsible sourcing policies actually on the ground? So one could be cynical and think that they're just hot air, that these policies don't actually have a bite in terms of affecting the suppliers and workers of these suppliers. So first, we're going to ask this empirical question, but we're also interested from a welfare perspective, from an aggregate perspective, what happens to the welfare of workers in the economy from which these multinationals are sourcing. So not just to the firms and workers that are in a direct supply chain relationship with the multinational, but also firms and workers in the rest of the economy. So what we do in this paper is we first write a model that allows us to think in general equilibrium. So at the level of an economy, what is the incidence of multinationals rolling out one of these responsible sourcing policies? So the idea is that we don't want to just look in a reduced form what happens to those firms and workers that are directly in the supply chain, directly supplying to the multinationals, but also to the rest of the economy. And we want to think on average, what is happening to the sourcing economy's welfare, but also by worker type, let's say low skill, high skill workers. And we need such a model in order to think through these potential effects. Then from an empirical standpoint, what we do is we first build what we think is a unique data set. So we focus on the empirical context of Costa Rica. We look at the largest multinationals in this country that source locally. So they have an affiliate in the country and they're supplied locally. And we study what we do a comprehensive search of what are all the responsible sourcing policies that these multinationals have adopted in our study period, which starts in 2009. And you might ask, oh, why do you need a general equilibrium model? Why don't you just do an empirical, a reduced form exercise? Well, The reason why it's not enough just to stop at the reduced form evidence is that if you look at the last year of our analysis, which is 2019, 38% of the production of domestic firms in Costa Rica is done by firms that are under the umbrella of an RS code. So if these RS codes do have a bite, do have an effect on suppliers and firms, 38% of the domestic production would be affected. So it's not unreasonable to expect that there would be general equilibrium implications over the entire economy. So what we do then is we combine this data set with an event study design that allows us to provide evidence of what happens for suppliers, for the multinationals themselves, for workers at the exposed suppliers, and at the transaction level in transactions between multinationals and suppliers. And then at the end, we do the quantitative analysis that basically puts together the reduced form evidence with the framework that I've just mentioned. I'm going to skip over the preview of findings and the related literature in the interest of time. And very quickly, given that the length of the presentation, I won't be able to go patiently through the model, but I just want to give you sort of a big picture of where the model is coming from. And this is the baseline version of the model. If there are people in the audience who are interested in sort of reading the full beast, our working paper and the appendix provides all the derivations. But in this baseline environment, imagine two countries, Costa Rica, the rest of the world. We have to make an assumption about consumer preferences. The form that we are assuming here, CES, is very standard in trade models. We assume that the production function for domestic firms uses two types of workers, low-skilled workers and high-skilled workers. We need to acknowledge them both to look at the distributional effects of these policies. And we allow for these two types of workers to be imperfect substitutes in production. So there's an elasticity of substitution raw that we will need to estimate to know how firms substitute between high and low-skilled workers as their relative wages are changing. In this baseline version of the model, we're going to assume full employment, but we have an extension in the paper that also allows for unemployment and informality. And unemployment and informality is a very important, first-order feature in most developing countries where multinationals source from. So it was important to have this extension in the full-blown model. Then, in terms of the production, what we have is two types of firms, multinationals and domestic firms. And I will skip over the details, but what you need to know from this slide is multinationals, they hire workers locally, and they are supplied locally by producers of domestic varieties of the local goods, but they can also import. So they have the option of importing. Now, if we focus on the domestic firms, we allow domestic firms to choose, depending on their productivity, to supply domestic consumers or the multinational, but they have to pay a fixed cost to supply the two types of buyers. And these fixed costs are such that supplying a foreign multinational is harder. You have to be more productive than supplying a domestic buyer. So firms are positively selected into supplying to multinationals. And in this baseline version of the model, we're assuming monopolistic competition in the product market. And what this means is that there's a perfect pass-through of any kind of price increase that a domestic firm experiences to the buyer, to the multinational buyer. So in this baseline version of the model, if becoming a responsible supplier makes your production more expensive, there's a full pass-through of that cost increase to the multinational. And this is an assumption that we will relax. Now, in this environment, we are introducing responsible sourcing. We have to do it in a stylized way because the model is already quite challenging. But so how do we introduce it? We introduce it by assuming that when a domestic firm decides to comply with a responsible code, a responsible sourcing code, this makes its production costs higher, particularly for the low-wage workers. So for the low-wage workers, these low-wage workers would have to be paid times more than the prevailing market wage for all the other low-wage workers in the economy. Whereas we do not make the same assumption for the high-wage workers in those firms. Why? Because it's intuitive that the managers of those domestic suppliers were already having good working conditions, and it's the low-wage workers, the ones in precarious working conditions, for whom these responsible sourcing laws are actually binding. And another important assumption that we're making in the model, but that is backed up in the data, is that whenever a domestic firm decides to comply with responsible sourcing codes, they need to do that on their entire production. So they cannot have a production line for the multinational where they treat well workers, and then a production line for the domestic consumers where they continue to mistreat their workers. Whatever they agree on for the production line of the multinational, they also have to apply for the domestic market. And this is going to be a very important element through which the rollout of these RS policies will have general equilibrium implications. Then we're allowing for several alternative hypotheses that will sort of will influence what is the incidence, what is the effect of responsible sourcing policies on welfare. So first, what is the motivation of the multinational rolling out the RS policy, whether the multinational is profit maximizing or whether it's altruistic in its intentions. How much of the cost of this RS policy is borne by the supplier versus the multinational. And this is where we're relaxing the previous assumption of perfect pass-through. Then we're allowing for the possibility that RS codes are also accompanied by productivity gains. That's something that could happen for the firm. And last, in the model that I've showed before, up to this point, the labor market was perfectly competitive. So there was no sense in which wages were too low. Wages were efficiently set. However, if there's a distortion in the labor market, if there's monopsony power, then maybe wages were too low to begin with. So having wage floors like the ones introduced by our RS codes would address this market imperfection. So basically what we do, and we're going to link the empirical part with the model part, is we're going to look at some regressions, some empirical evidence that will map to derivations that we've done in the model in a very one-to-one way. So when we arrive to the empirical exercise, what we do is we're going to compare the outcomes for firms that are exposed to RS policies, suppliers that are exposed to RS policies, versus suppliers that are not exposed, domestic firms that are not exposed. So this type of comparison is one that accounts away for any sort of general equilibrium effects that are equally affecting both exposed and non-exposed firms. And we're aware of that. So when we go to the empirical analysis and we interpret the sign and magnitude of those effects through the lens of the model, we already know that those are reduced form effects that are controlling away for the general equilibrium exercises. Given that I'm slow on time and I need to move forward, I will just say that the empirical evidence that we provide in a couple of slides will allow us to shed light on which version of the world we're in, namely whether the labor market in our empirical setting, in the Costa Rican setting, is monopsonistic or not. And we will look at the signs of the effects of RS policy rollouts on different types of sales that exposed firms are making, for instance, sales to the multinational itself. And depending on the sign of those sales, we will be able to rule out certain views of the world that would make the model even more complex than it is already. So because, for instance, we're not observing an increase in the sales to the multinational rolling out the RS policy, we're going to qualitatively rule out the fact that there is monopsony in the labor market in Costa Rica. So now, before jumping directly into the empirical part, I'll just spend a minute on the welfare effect of RS policies. This is the aggregate welfare effect. So here we're not looking at the two worker types. This welfare effect has three components. Let me focus on 2 and 3 first. The second one is basically saying that if there is a productivity increase from RS policies for the supplier, this is something that is good for welfare. Any productivity increase is good. Of course, we need to multiply that, but by what share of the economy is actually benefiting from that productivity increase. It's not everyone benefiting from it, but if there was such a productivity increase, it's a good thing. The third term is saying, if multinationals are profit maximizing, and when they roll out an RS policy, they're getting a demand boost. Consumers in foreign markets are valuing the RS policy and are willing to buy more from that multinational. If that's the case, then this is something that will boost demand for inputs from the sourcing economy, and this is something good for welfare. And then the last term that I will mention here is the one that has to do with the fact that there's a cost increase from complying to RS policies. You have to pay higher wages. You have to improve the safety conditions of your workers. This is cost increasing. The good thing, however, is that if most multinationals are export oriented, then this cost increase, and if this cost increase is fully passed over to the multinational, who then passes over that cost increase to its foreign buyers, then this is as if the RS policy is an export tax. And through a classic terms of trade channel, it's something that is welfare improving. Of course, the pass-through of this cost increase from the supplier to the multinational might not be full. So if the multinational has a strong bargaining power, it might be that part of this cost increase is actually borne by the supplier. So the more this happens, the less this is a good thing for welfare. And second, the more these suppliers that are complying to RS policies are then also having a lot of sales to the domestic consumers, this is something that is welfare decreasing. Why? Because these are inputs that are more expensive, and this is increasing the domestic price index in the local economy. Okay. So very quickly, the data is very rich. Costa Rican data, administrative data, we observe all firm-to-firm relationships in the country. We observe all worker-to-firm relationships. That's the met employer-employee data. We observe typical balance sheet variables about the firms. We observe their imports and exports, and we observe which of them are multinationals or not. And to that, we add some other data sets on the performance of multinationals overall as the group, or on NGO campaigns against the multinationals, and on potential CEO changes in the multinationals, just to allow us to see what's going on with those multinationals when they roll out the RS policies. In the interest of time, I will sort of fly over a couple of slides. What I want you to remember is we're focusing on the biggest multinationals in the country. We're doing very comprehensive search of their RS policies, and we're finding about 165 of them in our study period. And importantly, most of these RS rollouts are done at the headquarter level. It's something that has to do with the entire multinational group. It's not something that is Costa Rica specific. Multinationals that roll out RS policies are big, successful firms that you've heard of. Think Walmart, Cisco, Boston Scientific, all across several industries. The domestic firms are, of course, much smaller. and they tend to be much more in services. So, the typical supply chain relationship that people think about is a supplier in manufacturing with a buyer in manufacturing, but that's actually not the typical relationship in a developing country. Why do we focus on RS policies and working conditions? Because these tend to be the biggest lion's share of the supplier codes of conduct of multinationals. And also, why do we focus in the context of Costa Rica? Because you might think maybe, Costa Rican labor protection is very strong. So maybe introducing RS policies on working conditions in Costa Rica will not have any effect because already suppliers and workers are well treated. Well, what we find is that even if from a statutory perspective, the labor protection in Costa Rica seems high, in practice, there's a lot of non-compliance. Why? Because the Costa Rican government lacks the resources to enforce its labor protection. So in practice, there's a lot of room to actually improve working conditions in the country. So now let me get to because I know I'm running short on time, to show you some empirical evidence. Here, I don't know how familiar everyone is with an event study, but basically what we're doing is we're going to look at the outcomes of firms before and after being exposed to an RS policy. The way we define exposure is you're selling to a multinational about to roll out an RS policy the next year. So if the multinational rolls it out in 2011, you're an exposed supplier or an exposed worker if you're a supplier or a worker at a supplier selling to that multinational the year before in 2010. That's how we define exposure. And this is a within firm comparison. This is what we do when you have firm fixed effects. And we're also controlling for any shocks at the sector by year level. And I will just skip. And when we show the results at the worker level and the transaction level, the fact that we have very rich data about relationships between workers and firms or between buyers and sellers, we're going to introduce fixed effects that allow us to look at the outcomes for a given worker in a given working relationships, or for a given supplier in a given buying relationship. Okay, so now in the last 2-3 minutes that I have, let me just show you a couple of results. So what we find at the supplier level for exposed suppliers is a shrinkage, both in measure the sales as an employment. So these firms are not selected into exposure to RS policies. They seem to be very similar to the control firms that are not exposed. However, after the exposure, they shrink. The exposure is putting together at the same time both firms that continue in the relationship with the multinational and firms that do not. So this is capturing both the extensive margin effect of the breaking of certain relationships and the intensive margin effect, what is happening within a given relationship. What kind of firms are driving our results? Mostly small firms, so small suppliers, and suppliers in services. We think this is intuitive. Why? Because small firms and suppliers and firms in services are those firms that are the least under the auditing umbrella of a government. It's sort of the wild, wild west for those small firms in less regulated service industries. So it's very plausible that it's for those firms that we see the biggest effect. And if we ask ourselves, what are the multinationals that are driving this shrinkage of the exposed suppliers? It's sort of the usual suspects are the firms that are serious about the RS policies, are firms from high GDP per capita countries, countries where the headquarter is where firms are well managed, where labor protections are strong. So these are the multinationals that are serious about the RS policies that are imposing, and those are the ones for which we see the effect. Now, focusing on the worker level and just focus on the right, what we see is that if we look at wages of the workers that are at exposed suppliers, If they are in the bottom quartile, if they're the low-wage workers, they're the ones who are benefiting the most from an increase in wages. But if we're talking about the managers of those suppliers or the top earners in those firms, their wages are constant. So again, the RS policies are really targeted at the lowest paid, most precarious workers. What happens to relative employment? As high-wage workers become relatively cheaper relative to low-wage workers, firms are becoming more skill-intensive. That's natural. What happens in the relationship with the RS multinational? If we put together intensive and extensive margins, so remember, extensive margin are those relationships that break, we find a big fall in the sales to the multinational itself. And if we look on the right-hand side, most of this fall, we conclude, is coming from the extensive margin. It's coming from the fact that their relationships breaking, either because the multinational does not feel that the supplier can meet its standards, or because the supplier doesn't think it's profitable anymore to remain in a supplying relationship with that multinational. What happens in the relationship of these suppliers to everyone else? So to all the other buyers that these suppliers, exposed suppliers have, other than the multinational itself that rolled out the RS policy? Well, what we see is that those sales are slightly harmed. And this is in line with this idea that if you agree to comply to the policies of responsible sourcing, this is something that you need to comply with on all your production lines, not just the production line with the multinational itself. And then the last empirical slide, and then I will conclude in the next minute or so, is on what happens to the multinational itself. Why do we need to know what is happening to the multinational itself? We need to know because we need to estimate whether there is a demand shifter or not from RS. So we need to know what is happening overall to the multinational performance, multinational sales, to know whether there was a demand shifter or not that would counteract the increase in input costs from the responsible suppliers. And the fact that we find a flat line doesn't mean that there's nothing happening to the multinational. It means that there is some small demand shifter that counteracts the fact that now inputs are more expensive. Okay, I'm going to skip a bit of the quantification part, but for those of you who are more on the nerdy side and would appreciate the model, a neat feature of how we do the relationship between the model and the data is that there's actually a very simple system of equations where you can see on the left-hand side the different empirical estimates that I've just shown you, and on the right-hand side, relationships between different parameters of the model. And you just solve some simple systems, like here in this case, 4 equations and 4 unknowns, to find out the parameters of interest. And let me just focus on these parameters here. Tau was the increase in costs for the supplier for the low-wage workers. And what we're finding is that on average, RS policies lead to an 11% higher input cost for the suppliers. There is a small demand increase for the multinational rolling out the RS policy, but it's really tiny. So it seems that this is more about reputation protection and risk insurance than it is about immediate profit maximization. And the beta, which was the pass-through parameter, is not 1. If it was 1, it was perfect pass-through. So what does it mean that it's 0.8? It means that not the entire cost increase on the supplier is actually passed over to the multinational. The multinational is a strong, high bargaining power buyer, so it's basically pushing part of the cost increase onto its suppliers. And I know I'm out of time, so I'll just conclude with this slide. This slide is putting everything together, and I had to skip a lot of steps, but for those of you just interested in the welfare takeaways, let's just focus on the blue lines. And what the blue lines are telling us is what has happened to the welfare of different groups of workers in the Costa Rican economy once we've introduced these RS policies. And if we focus here on the exposed low-wage workers, their welfare went up by 8%. It's a good thing. Their real wages have really increased. And that's natural. Those are the workers that are explicitly targeted by the RS policies. However, if you look at the non-exposed low-wage workers, so the remaining 80% of low-wage workers that are not in the supply chain of a multinational that has rolled out an RS policy, their welfare has fallen by more than 3%. Why is that? And there are two reasons. First, because for a set of workers, of low-wage workers, their wages have gone up. Overall, in general equilibrium, this has lowered the demand for low-wage workers in relative sense to high-wage workers. So this has put downward pressure on wages for low-wage workers in the entire economy. And second, because there's a leakage of the policy to domestic consumption, these suppliers are not selling everything to the multinational, and the multinational is exporting everything. There's part of these RS, responsibly sourced goods that are staying in the Costa Rican economy and are more expensive. This has led to an increase in domestic prices. So in a real sense, low-wage workers are worse off for two reasons. And the high-wage workers, they're slightly better off, but there's a higher demand for high-wage workers. They're relatively cheaper. However, they're also suffering from the higher domestic prices. So I know I'm out of time, and Hannah and Ben will be upset with me, so I will stop here. I hope I've motivated that responsible sourcing policies are important. We need to learn more about them, using models, using data, all of that. We find that RS policies are not just hot air. We do find strong effects on exposed firms and workers. We show that in the theory part, it's not clear a priori whether it's a good thing or a bad thing for an economy overall to be exposed to RS policies. And we found that, yes, there are good gains for low-wage workers that are exposed, but the story is less rosy for non-exposed low-wage workers. Thank you so much for your attention, and apologies for going over time.
Thanks so much, Isabela. No need to apologize. That was a really great presentation. We gave you a hard job because it's a technical paper with a really, for people studying PhDs and young researchers, it's really a great example of how to write a paper with a complex model and some really interesting empirics, but to do it in an accessible way. So I do recommend the paper to everyone. And I think we can see from your presentation just how relevant and accessible the findings are. So thank you very much for going through that. Let me hand over without any further ado to Sara, who's going to give us a different take, I think, on some of these issues, and we can get the dialogue launched off from there. So Sara, floor is yours. You're muted.
Sorry about that. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen here, and hopefully you can hear me now. Thank you, Isabela. That was such a great presentation, and I'm so excited to kind of go through some of my take on it. My background is in law and consulting, and I've worked with a lot of those multinational companies and on some of those supplier policies. And I think that what I'd like to go through first is to go into a very high level look at all these different concepts that we're hearing a lot about. We're looking at ESG, sustainability, all these different concepts that came in recently, as my daughter walks in right on cue. And at the core of all these issues is really one thing, which is companies wanting to do good. Now, some argue about the intention there and the goodwill, but companies wanting to do good and show that they're doing good. And there's a lot of difficulties there because, number one, how do you show it? How do you prove it, right? How do you show in the data and everything? And so what's really exciting to me about this sort of research is the ability to have better visibility into the impact of all these different corporate policies and decisions. As you have a practitioner trying to make ethical sourcing decisions or manage their supply chain across the global value chain more responsibly, it's difficult to get these insights and, you know, really put it all together and say, okay, is this good? Is this bad? Is this going to have a net positive impact? And then how are we going to communicate that out? And it really goes through so many different, you know, areas, and I can jump into these, but, you know, a few to just highlight. We're seeing a lot about ESG recently in the news and everywhere. And ESG is the environmental, social, and governance standards and metrics that companies can use to put together internally the risk assessment, looking internally, okay, how are we doing from an ESG standpoint, but then also communicating to investors and others about their impact, right? Looking at, you know, you have all these investors looking and say, I want to invest in ESG stocks. Well, what does that mean? It means that companies that are doing good in the environmental, social, and governance, you know, stream of factors. And as you break down the social piece, one big focus will be the labor implications, right? If you look deep down in your supply chain, whether it's your subsidiaries or even whether it's a, you know, an unrelated supplier or their suppliers or, you know, their suppliers, looking through that and trying to really capture what is the impact. So coming into ESG, certainly that's going to be so helpful to have more data and more information. Looking at from a consumer perspective, we're seeing so many claims out there, right? A company saying, well, we're so sustainable, we're sustainably sourcing, we are ethically sourcing, but it's very difficult to communicate specifically why that is or how you back that up. And that's a big evolving area in the EU. There's a lot of happenings there. And in the US, it's really coming as well in terms of you're saying all these things to the consumers, but how are you backing that up? And so if you're saying you have an ethical supply chain or a sustainable supply chain, you need to, today and especially more in the future, will need to be kind of showing evidence to really back all those claims up. And then, you know, from the consumer perspective and the humanitarian perspective, there's other gains here, right? From the consumer side, we want to have that information so we can make more informed choices. So this visibility is so exciting to me in a lot of different ways. One thing that's highlighted in the paper, which I thought was great, was we're really looking at today we're looking at labor, but as it was mentioned in the paper that we also could use a lot of this sort of research measuring the environmental impact, right? So we looked at the social impact extensively here, and looking at the environmental side would be so beneficial as well. And we need more and more of this kind of evidence to create a bit better picture so that companies and regulators can make those right decisions, because there's so much uncertainty into, okay, we want to provide positively made products, we want to provide ethical products, but what does that mean? And are our efforts really leading to the positive impact that we want to see? And I'm going to wrap up real quickly, and I'm glad to dive into anything in the Q&A. But when we look at this specific paper, you know, looking at the gains for some employees that work, you know, specifically with these M&Es and the suppliers, that's such a great thing to be able to say, okay, we made these policies, and yes, the welfare impact on those laborers, those workers really was positive. And so you can, you know, businesses and consumers have more confidence after looking at data like this and saying, yes, we are creating more ethical products. We are creating products that are more in line with the values of our consumers and, you know, under certain working conditions and wages that our consumers are more comfortable with or really seeking out. On the other side, you know, the additional findings in terms of the negative impact and the decreased business overall, now that's, you know, paints a different picture. And so how do you take that balance and all these different pieces of information and put it together as a practitioner to say, well, what can we do to do good? You know, let's say that the MNE, the multinational entity really, really wants to do good. How do we take this information, put it together and put it into our policies from all throughout the global value chain? And so that's really my question back to Isabela is, what do you hope that the multinationals are going to take from this type of data and bring it into corporate decision-making throughout the global value chain?
Okay,
And
thanks
I'll
so much,
share it
Sarah.
with that.
And that's a great question to end on. I mean, I think it's a good question for any piece of economic research. What do people do with it afterwards? So let me throw that to Isabela first. I mean, I know that you're a researcher, you're an academic, so the pleasure for you comes from having a nice model and some interesting results. But of course, people are going to pick this up and read it and use it. What do you hope the impact is of a paper like this?
Thank you for your kind words, and I want to thank Sara for a very thoughtful discussion. And also I want to thank her for sending the question in advance. She gave me some heads up to
We've
to
just
totally
lost
think
yours.
about the question. The academics, okay, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Better? So typically we think, what should the social planner do? What should the government do? So as academics, we're much less asked, what should a given firm do? So I think it's actually a very nice switch of perspective. A couple of thoughts. I'll take them a bit in order of the presentation of Sara. On the environmental part, the reason why we didn't focus on Costa Rica in the environmental part is that in that particular empirical setting, it would not have been binding. Costa Rica is a country where 99% of the energy is fully renewable. So it was just not the right setting where to ask whether RS policies have a bite or not. But there are many other contexts around the world where the environmental chapter of these supplier codes of conduct will plausibly have a bite. And I think the model that we wrote is a good starting point for a model there, but it would need to add the fact that environmental requirements lead to externalities. And that's a very different type of model than the model that we have in mind. In our case, if those workers in the responsible supply chain are better treated, there's no positive externality on the rest of the workers. This is making the relative demand for low-wage workers fall and prices are increasing in the economy. So there's no concept of a positive externality there. However, if we're thinking about climate change and resource like waste management and so on and so forth, I think there's an entire host of fascinating questions that we haven't even scratched the surface of. Another important mention, Costa Rica was not an empirical context where to think about child labor or forced labor. I mean, that's an entirely different model than one would have to write. That would not be an increase in costs, right? We would have to think very differently about what it means to abolish child labor and how to model that and the welfare implications of that. So I think our model, we hope, is a good, and our way of conducting the analysis is a good starting point, but we're hopeful that there's more research that also thinks about these other chapters in the responsible sourcing policies that actually might have a very important bite in the global south. I just wanted to put it out there in terms of thinking about external validity of what we find. Now, going to the question of Sara, what should multinationals do? I think first and foremost, they need to acknowledge that, again, thinking narrowly about the working conditions chapter and what it means to comply with those chapters, it's going to lead to cost increases for those suppliers. They have to pay benefits, sick leave, maternity leave. They have to allow workers to unionize. They have to provide safety equipment. They have to reorganize their production for it to be safe, maybe change machines. It's very costly to comply to RS policies. So how multinationals offer, volunteer to chip in on the costs of that adjustment is key. You might say, we're not finding full pass-through of the cost increase to the multinational. Multinationals have a strong bargaining power, and they can basically bully their suppliers into all of a sudden, if you want to continue being my supplier, you have to be a responsible supplier. Good luck with that. So if that's the attitude that multinationals have, I'm being very informal and very loose here, but sort of so my academic self is not very happy with how the language I'm using. But what I'm trying to say is that it's not just about putting forward a set of rules. It's also about how multinationals think about who's going to bear the cost of that increase in costs for the supplier. And if there's no demand shifter, if consumers are not willing to pay more for responsibly sourced goods, then the multinational has to put its money where its mouth is against its own profits. So, it could be that it's profit maximizing to do RS policies, and it's profit maximizing for the multinational to fully take on the cost increase to the extent that consumers themselves are willing to pay for responsibly sourced goods. But if consumers are not willing and multinationals still want to be do-gooders, then they have to put their money where their mouth is, meaning they have to take on more of the cost increase of what responsible sourcing does. This is a really long-winded answer. I hope it was helpful.
No, I think that's a great answer. And actually, for me, one of the really interesting results was what you find on the demand shifter. That it's basically zero.
So the way we're interpreting that
to zero.
Yes,
please.
So the way we're interpreting that is not that it's not, because we're looking at a time horizon which is like 4 or 5 years after the rollout. So we're not able to say something about the long-term benefits of having a responsible supply chain. So if you're thinking multinationals are profit maximizer, but what they're maximizing over is something that also has to do with the uncertainty of a Rana Plaza disaster. Mm-hmm. And what they were doing is they're insuring themselves against such a disaster. This is a rare event. It's not an event that we would observe maybe on average in the 3-4 year span of our analysis, but it's still profit maximizing for the firm to insure itself against a reputational disaster. So we're not saying, the D is small, the demand shifter is small, therefore multinationals are altruistic. I'm more cynical, so I don't think that's the case. I think that they're just insuring themselves against adverse events.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense to me. I think that's a really good interpretation. I guess though, when I saw like what D looked like, I was thinking of it in a sort of consumer willingness to pay perspective. And, I think one thing that the paper does very nicely, and that your discussion, in the sort of informal sense just did now, is to emphasize that in general equilibrium, there's always got to be someone paying for what's going on. It's always getting shifted around. And I think your model does that shifting in really smart ways. And I think, the results highlight that it's not a cost-free exercise to do this. So someone somewhere has to pay for it. And the discussion is really on a policy level all about who is going to do that.
Exactly. And something else to emphasize, because Sara emphasized it rightfully so on the last slide, there are workers at exposed suppliers who are losing their jobs, right? So we're talking on average that the low-wage workers at exposed suppliers are better off. But, if the multinational says, no one left behind, and even if they don't care about the general equilibrium implications, but they care about the supplier who is now all of a sudden forced to become a responsible supplier, already thinking about what is happening to that group of workers and how many of them will have to be laid off so there are a lot of nuances that I hope the paper is emphasizing. I think there are a couple of questions about the productivity. And
I was actually going to ask you if you wanted to address. We've got a few nerdy questions,
That's
which
great.
I'm sure you'll be happy to go into. We're all nerds.
Yeah, so I see there's several that have to do, if I read them fast, that have to do with productivity. So I think I had to skip that slide, but the way we're estimating productivity, we're saying if there is a productivity gaining element of RS policies, that if for whatever reason now you have safety helmets and all that, and you're just happier and therefore more productive at your employment, we assume that this would be something that we would see across all workers in the firm. It's not something that is just benefiting the low-wage workers. It increases the motivation of everyone. So we would have to see that in the wages of the high-wage workers in exposed firms relative to non-exposed firms. So the fact that we found a flat line for the wages of high-wage workers in exposed firms versus high-wage workers in non-exposed firms, we interpret that as evidence against the productivity gain. So another way in which multinationals could lead to more, welfare improvements is by adding, on top of the requirements, also adding a productivity enhancing element to these RS policies. So we have previous work with Jose Vasquez and Alonso Alfaro Reina, a QJ that we're publishing this year, showing that there are productivity gains upon first joining the supply chain of a multinational. So we're not saying there are no productivity gains from being a supplier to a multinational.
Yeah.
What we're saying in this paper is there's no extra kick for firms that are already suppliers to multinationals, but that on top of that have the RS policy. So if there was an RS increasing element to the policies, that would be another way in which multinationals could help their suppliers more. And then I think there was a question about the efficiency of the labor market. So in the baseline model, we're assuming the labor market to be competitive, but then there's this other version of the model, this different, it's a different model because it's hard to embed monopsonistic competition into the rest of the model. If there were inefficiencies manifested as markdowns on wages, so coming through the labor market power of firms in Costa Rica, then there were some predictions on the signs of some of our empirical results. And what we found was not in line with the Costa Rican labor market being monopsonistic. In most developing countries, most of firms are tiny or atomistic. So it's not unreasonable that we find that the labor market looks more like a competitive labor market than a monopsonistic labor market. This does not need to be the case in all economies. It could be that in some economies, the labor market is monopsonistic, and then there is a policy rationale for introducing wage floors or minimum wages or so on and so forth. So the model, in our model, you can have that possibility. It's just that in our particular empirical setting of Costa Rica, we don't find empirical evidence for it. But I want to emphasize that the model is not Costa Rica specific. It's the quantification that is Costa Rica specific, based on what we find in its setting.
Yeah, I actually think that's a really important point. And maybe just before we wrap up, I can kind of emphasize that. And correct me if I say anything wrong here, but the data work is obviously specific to Costa Rica, but the model is much more general. So one thing I really love about the model is you have all these variations, in the way that we do now in 7 appendixes to the paper. But, it seemed to me that there are at least 3 things that might be different across countries that would lead to a different empirical result. One is the one that you just mentioned, which is the structure of the labor market. So, we know that here in the US, for example, there's a ton of work suggesting that things like minimum wages don't tend to increase unemployment, all this sort of thing. So there's substantial evidence of monopsony in labor market. Is it replicated elsewhere? That's something we are still learning, but that's one thing that could be different. A second thing that could be different is pass-through. So the way in which the cost increase is sent through or not sent through to the multinational. So again, you allow a full range of that in the theory part of the model. And then there's a particular quantification in Costa Rica that could be different elsewhere. And then of course the leakage as well. So the way in which these policies spill over to the domestic market could conceivably be quite different in other settings. So if I read your paper correctly, you've set up a very general theoretical framework that helps us think about this. Then you've given us one example of how it plays out in a situation where we've got good reason to believe that the particular measures you're looking at are binding, but there's also an invitation, right? And I'm issuing the invitation to people who are sort of watching here from different countries, which is to go out and get similar data and replicate at least the empirical part of the paper to see if we get different results elsewhere. Is that sort of a fair takeaway from what you're doing?
I think it's a very fair takeaway. Of course, the model could have had even more bells and whistles. Any model is always based on some assumptions, but so in that sense, it's not as general as it could be. But we try to have several cases embedded in them that would vary across countries. Like, for instance, the prevalence of unemployment and informality across economies is another important difference. I know we're 1 minute over, but I just noticed that there's a question of Ivan that I haven't answered. Should I 30 seconds answer it? Or
please.
Okay. I apologize, Ivan. I'm bad at multitasking. So you're asking, RS is not just about wage increases. There are other things such as improvements in safety conditions, and that's not something that we would be measuring in wages. Great point. What we do in the model when we actually estimate the TAO, the cost increase, we don't estimate the TAO, the cost increase, based on what happens to wages alone. That graph where I show the wages, that's just suggestive that there is something going on at the worker level. But what we actually do is we look at what happens to the sales of these suppliers to different types of buyers. There was that system of 4 equations and 4 unknowns, and all of the things on the left were sales. And we're inferring, based on what has happened to sales, what must have happened to the cost structure of the firm. And there, everything that is a variable cost increase, that is something that increases with the number of low-wage workers, is something that we will capture in that estimation. So maternity benefits, safety measures, anything else that is a variable cost increase, we are capturing it in the 11%. And that's why the 11% is higher than the 4% that we found for the wages, because it captures many other things that are not wages and that we cannot observe in the kind of data that we have. Sorry for going over time. And thank you so much, everyone, for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think we will. Hannah's got a hand up. So last word.
Yeah, no, it's a question for Sara. So it's a question about policy. So given what we see here in Isabela's, right, about the positive externalities or not positive externalities for the economy, right? So you put pressure on these M&Es to do better and to show better. And so the question is, for policymakers, what you're seeing, you're working on the M&A stage. So what would you say is, what's the most important thing that they could do?
The policymakers, or the
yes,
policymakers. I mean, I think there's a lot. Yeah, there's a lot you could do. We're seeing a lot of legislation coming out. So, one example is the Uyghur, Forced Labor Protection Act, and you have, that's in the U.S., where you have goods coming from the Uyghur province in China, and the burden is shifted to the importer to prove that it's not made with forced labor. So similar efforts can be made to bring these things into reality, where we're forcing these different standards. But I think in practice right now, right, we're seeing, as Isabela mentioned, you have these companies asking more from the suppliers for the same amount of cost generally, and being honest about that is really important. Of, how can we either increase our payment to you, or even provide other support. So we do see that also, where M&Es are providing support that's non-monetary to help bring these things about. And then just one other thing I wanted to mention in response is just to highlight that oftentimes, especially in Asia, you'll see suppliers that work for a number of M&Es, right? So that increased compliance burden and ethical compliance burden can be shared across M&Es, and that can maybe make it more feasible going forward.
That's a really good point. Thank you. I just saw that Apple came out and said that they would, we're really going to start pushing their suppliers. And I'm like, don't you have, the bargaining powers? little off there. But Ben, I just had to do that. I'm very sorry. Yeah. No, I'm not sorry.
Well, I think, sorry, I just also, Isabella, one thing is, as you go to Asia, right, it's harder, especially in China, sometimes it's harder to get the visibility to the data. Is that, from the economics perspective, is that true that, you know, it might be a little bit harder to do this sort of empirical study when it comes to certain areas in China or otherwise?
I'm not as familiar with data access for China, but I know that the kind of administrative data sets that we have access to for Costa Rica are becoming increasingly more available in other Latin American countries, in several sub-Saharan countries, Pakistan, India. I think the issue with, as you go across countries, is that as you go to countries where informality is more and more prevalent, administrative data sets cover a smaller and smaller share of the overall economy. So, you know, what do you want to infer about what is happening to the rest of the economy as a result of anything, including responsible sourcing, becomes a bit more of a stretch. But that doesn't mean those economies should not be studied using administrative data sets. But then how one thinks about informality, for instance, becomes much more front and center if you go to Rwanda, where it's 70–80%. So, you know, there are limits as to what administrative data sets coming from tax records can do. Just to put it out there. But I think this kind of data sets are becoming increasingly available across all continents.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to close on. I'm conscious that we've gone a few minutes over, so we've taken a little more of everyone's time than we intended to. But it's been a really great session. So thanks both to Sara and Isabela. It's an area that I've got a lot of personal interest in, and I learned so much both from reading the paper and also listening to the discussion. So I'm really grateful for the time that you've given us today. Let me just say 2 words about our next session, which is coming up on January 26th. So we're going to be talking about technical barriers to trade and product quality, looking at firm level data. So it's my colleague and friend Ha from the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia. And she's going to be presenting. We have an excellent discussant lined up. So if that's something that interests you, please mark it in your diary for January 26th. As usual, it's a Thursday at 9 a.m. Eastern time. And with that, I'll say thank you very much to Isabela, also to Sara, and of course to my partner in crime, Hannah. We wish everyone the very best for the end of year holidays, and we look forward to reconnecting in January. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much
Thank
again.
you so very much.
A pleasure meeting you all.
Likewise.
Oh, and by the way, I love how people are commenting on the things that they learned in the paper. We're going to have to make that into a regular thing. That was super cool. Thank you so much for the people who did that. Happy holidays, everybody. Thank you, ladies.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ben.